on mute? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so guys, there's something on the screen, just a couple of, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat box, that's great. Some of you are doing that. Have a bit of a think, because what we didn't want to do was set up a session where it was very directive, like you must do this, you must do that. We really just wanted to know what was kind of live in you around mental health for co-production. So the sorts of things you want to talk about. So take a minute and type what you would like to talk about today in the chat box, and then we'll take it from there. Is that all right?
Yeah.
And just a note, because I can't mute everybody, not that I want to, but sometimes if you're not on mute, there's a little bit of background noise. So pop yourself on mute if you can. Hello, Rachel. So I think you were here yesterday. Nice to see you again. Hello, Tracy. Gemma, hi, Gemma. Thanks, Tula. So Tula's got a question in there that we could talk about. So I just want to kind of say to people that you don't need to have your cameras on, you don't need to say anything. If you'd like someone to read out a question for you, type it in the chat box, and we'll do that. So far, Rachel has said, could we talk about the way mental health is being approached in society? So that's one question. Tula said she's interested in developing Ways to Wellbeing programme, which some of us know what that is, but we'll explain. So that's about learning for mental health, really. Jo would like to talk about adult mental health services in the area.
Yeah.
Hi, Jo.
Hi, are you all right?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Yes.
And Rob says he works at the council and would like to learn, but also wondering how we can utilise culture in Southend more to help with mental health. That sounds an interesting, I mean, they're all interesting questions, but that is interesting as well. Oh, Rachel, so Rachel, to clarify, I've got a couple of Rachels. So it's Rachel Roach that has asked the question about the way society's approaching mental health. Okay, so we've got 19 people on the call at the moment. I think that's, we were expecting a few more, but we've only got an hour, so probably need to make a start. Roger, do you want to take it off share screen, please? Oh, thank you. That's really great. And Jane is from Essex County Council and would like to look at ways to talk about some of the retendering work and also COVID. So there's quite a lot there, isn't there? Okay. Right, so in my head, what we have got now is we're going to have a vote on what we want to talk about first. But I kind of need to type it in the chat box with numbers, otherwise we won't remember, because I want to make it fair. Or shall we? How about if we start with Rachel Roach's question?
Yeah. And
start the discussions, and then I'll just keep an eye on the time and we'll get to everybody. So, how is mental health being approached in society at the moment? What do people think about the way we're approaching mental health in society at the moment?
Society in general, this isn't including professionals in the mental health area, but general society still still has a large stigma attached to any form of mental health, that the person can't be stable, can't hold down a job, or if they are able to hold down a job, and they can't possibly have mental illness and doesn't need support. You have to either be one extreme or the other in society's eyes. I think there needs to be a lot more education on mental health and all the different areas of mental health within society, because it's still something that people push aside. They don't want to think about it, they don't want to talk about it.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Jo. Jo, that's a really interesting point. Does anyone else want to talk a little bit about the approach we're taking? Oh, Rachel Wood has said, recognise that everyone has emotional health and well-being, and I think that's something that's come up in discussions I've heard lately, which is that because the conversation shifted to everybody having mental health, it's inclusive, so that's great, but equally it is a spectrum and people can move up and down, and that's what you're saying, Jo, isn't it? So it's about the services we can receive depending on where we are in the spectrum, maybe, and who gets to decide that, perhaps.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Hi, it's Keith.
Oh, Keely.
I was just going to say also, I don't work in mental health, so I might be wrong, but we need to look at sort of like culture and mental health. So, for example, like in the African and Caribbean community, there's no such thing as mental health. So if a child is diagnosed with something like autism, they live in this country, they tend to send the child back home thinking that's going to get rid of the autism. I've seen it happen a lot. And obviously the child's still autistic, they're just being treated for it, or they're not, you know. So culture plays a huge sort of part along with the stigma as well. So there's a stigma attached as well. So even if they do believe that there are certain mental health issues, it's just sort of like the old school, it's looked down on, you're crazy, something's wrong with you, etc.
Thanks, Keely. So could that be, you know, that sometimes if there's a mental health issue in a particular culture, people might go to church perhaps rather than going to a mental health service? Well,
believe it or not, they do still do stuff like there are exorcisms and stuff like that still happen. So they will, like, you would put it like go to the church. That's the most sort of low level form that they would do. They would pray, whatever. But I've seen cases where when I worked in Camden, where like children are hurt, like severely hurt because they was just trying to do exorcism or something. So that's the very extreme. But general, like I know they're trying to do a lot around mental health for Black males, because I think that's been going on as well, because there's a higher rate of suicide of Black males as well. But I think so co-production could help with that, because there's a huge barrier. It's ingrained in generations as well. So I think co-production to like work with that population and find out how they would like to be helped would be beneficial.
I think that's so interesting, isn't it? Because when we think about mental health services, we don't necessarily think of them being in faith-based places. We tend to think of that being in clinics and things. So, but we also know, perhaps from the data, that maybe schizophrenia, Black males are overrepresented, that maybe people from different ethnic minorities that don't engage with mental health services in the community. So there's lots there. I can see Joanne's got her hand up, sorry.
I think it's also handy to note that there's a big generational gap with things like that as well, because along the ADHD autism type line, even with my dad, he struggles to see past the naughty boy issues that it would have been described as when they were younger. And obviously, because of some of my little one's got ADHD, so it is quite a big difference between how the generations see things as well.
Thank you, Jo. And I think that's an interesting point around the kind of different generations. Rachel Roach, who raised the original question, has said education plays a huge role. So yeah, I mean, there's different types of education. If you think about schools, mental health services in schools, I think there is an initiative that's going to put mental health practitioners in schools. Is there anyone that knows a bit more about that could share?
I used to work for school nursing, and the nurses would include mental health as part of what they would teach to the kids. So I do think that will, with time, go into sort of whole generational thing we're talking about. So even if they are just educating children on different types of mental health issues, if they get older, the younger generation will have that knowledge and it will go down.
I just add, sorry, I don't know how to put my hand up here. If I could just add as well, I think the whole issue of the impact on younger people's mental health due to social media and internet exposure the whole time, I think maybe that accounts for some of the generational differences, because that has really brought to the fore issues of how the way we communicate and our environment and our culture actually impacts on our mental health. And it has raised the issue. People are much more familiar with how, for example, bullying can undermine someone's mental well-being and actually, you know, result in quite serious conditions. So perhaps that's an element of it, because that, in my mind, feels like the most talked about aspect of mental health often, you know, in the media and generally, you know, amongst non-professionals. So I just wondered if that was connected as well.
Thank you, Jane. I mean, I think that's it feels like the kind of digital age has changed everything really, and we're kind of, as humans, we're just trying to navigate that system. I mean, I used to work in mental health settings 25 years ago in London, and the only people who came into mental health settings had what were classed as severe and enduring mental health issues. So bipolar, schizophrenia, sort of chronic, acute depression. We can't have chronic acute, but you know what I mean. Serious depression, life limiting. Whereas now there's a lot more complex needs out there. There are all those other diagnoses, but it just seems to include a lot more people, and it does feel that maybe the pace of life, social media, the internet, you know, humans are adjusting to that. So Jo Tyler has said that mental well-being and emotional resilience seems to be much more a part of the school curriculum in recent years. I mean, I'm a parent. I kind of wonder about that actually, but I'm not a student in school. Is there anybody who sort of has had recent experience of this curriculum in college or school that could sort of speak to that a bit? Hello, Rachel. Rachel Roach. Hi. Can you? What would you like to say about that?
I studied health and social care at college, and I've studied quite a few things at college, and I would admit that when it comes down to the education, unless you're taking a specific topic, i.e. health and social care, you don't necessarily learn certain things, especially when you're at school. And I do believe that the main way that we can help will either reduce the stigma against mental health within society is to tackle it when it's early on. So for example, when you'd learn PSHE, you should also learn an element of mental health, like natural mental health, etc. Because one, that will help people realise, hang on a minute, I have actually got a problem, I need to go get it sorted. And in the terms of the way in which I completely agree with, with Rachel Wood, about it depends on what area of the spectrum you're on, because I have mental health, my family does as well. My sister has tried several times to commit suicide, and it was only after the second or third time she actually received help. So I think instead of it getting to that severity, we need to tackle it earlier on, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Thank you for sharing, Rachel. Yes, it does. And I think that prevention work is something that services that I know of in Southend are definitely kind of gearing more towards, but those tend to be the community services, so the local charities and things like that. I think when it comes to clinical services, what they call the thresholds to get a service are higher than they used to be, perhaps because of demand. I think Joe's going to say something.
Yeah, what you're saying, I think, resonates with everyone in terms of the difficulty in accessing the support. And, you know, from a commissioning perspective, what we're really focusing on is getting services in really early, and services that don't need a threshold to be met. So we're getting specialist mental health clinicians working at a GP level and at a primary care level, so that people can start to get specialist mental health support without having to meet a threshold for a service, or to have to be bad enough to get a service, because that's not what we want. There's a lot of work, and I hope that as people in our community, we will start to feel the changes over the next few months to get a lot more in at that level that doesn't need a threshold, that people just need proactive, early places to go, people to talk to, interventions and techniques that will help mental health and mental resilience. It has been a problem which we're hopefully trying to address it, and hearing this and being involved in these conversations reinforces to us the need to be doing more around that.
Thanks, Joe. I can see Sarah's going to speak.
Yeah, my position, I recognise that there's a big gap between the child being a child and then moving into adult services, and that huge gap at that really, really important stage is really, really unmet at this present time. I'm just wondering if there is anything that is being put in place to kind of bridge that gap.
That's a great question, Sarah. I mean, I don't feel in a position to. It's not for me to have the answers.
I can certainly talk to what we're trying to do is, because at the moment you've got children's mental health services and then you've got adults, and I agree the gap is massive, and that transition is so difficult for so many people. I think what we're trying to do in our new models of care is shift a lot of that provision to a primary care level so that it's fluid. There's no gap, there's no stop and start. People have access to support that's consistent and that hasn't got thresholds. There's still a lot of work to do to look at the gap between children's mental health services and specialist adult mental health services. And there are teams working across the wider Essex patch looking at the transition work. But the gap's acknowledged, and I think that's part of the first step in trying to fix it. But getting more stuff at a community level, at a primary care level, and with our third sector and voluntary organisations contributing as well, will hopefully provide more resource in and allow more people to get the support that they need. I think we've still got a long way to go, though.
Thanks, Joe. Tula's going to say something. Can I just check that everybody knows primary care is your GPs?
Just a comment, not really in my professional way, but in life, because like we all have mental health. What I find sometimes when I was doing Samaritan's work, people would phone because they could say, today I feel bad, and no one would take them to task the following day saying, oh, you are smiling today. You said you needed help. It's the allowing people to feel bad one day and survive or be okay the other day, so that, like you, Jessica, said, it sort of goes backwards and forwards instead of being put in a box and that's where you are and you are going to be having everything done to you regardless of. So it comes from the person and their needs rather than being in a bracket and then being given help. So it seemed to be a bit like that. I don't say it's now, but there is that kind of, if you tell your friends, oh, I'm feeling really bad, you better feel a week bad, because otherwise they feel they're wasted their empathy on you because you are feeling chipper the following day. Don't know if I'm like putting myself clearly, but it is sort of, it is not like black or white, like others have said as well.
Yeah, you're right, Tuna, and I think it speaks to something Joanne said in the chat, which is having to fight to be heard and believed is also a big issue from a parent's point of view and a peer supporter. So what interests me, co-production is built on relationships and trust, hopefully growing within those relationships. And I think if mental health services are co-produced, hopefully people don't have to prove themselves in need of those services. There's a lot of stuff in co-production about, you know, if you tell your story, then you've got a seat at the table. And Joe and I have talked about this before. We're a little bit wary of this idea that you know that you are somehow undeserving, because you know what you experience is what you experience. No one can know but yourself. And I think if we don't trust that people are the experts in their own health and well-being, then the service potentially is going to kind of not be a whole person service for all the people that might need it. Anyway, I've said too much there, really. I didn't want to. What time have we got? Okay, so I think this kind of might. Oh, Rachel wants to say something. I think Rachel Roach.
You can finish what you're saying.
I've finished. No, I've finished.
Oh, okay. Just going back to what Tula, I think your name is. I hope I pronounced that right. It is the thing that people don't understand is with mental health. Before you say anything, it's kind of like with alcoholism. The first step to receiving help is to admit that you have a problem. So if you say have been 2 years or even 6 months, right, say having symptoms of depression, and then you tell someone and then say the next day, you could have had such a good evening, you know, you could have had a family meal, watched some movies with your other half, I don't know, which has put you then in a good mood for the next day. But that's what people need to realise is the amount of time you've had to suffer in silence before you've said something, that bit there is very important, and that's what people don't see and that's what people don't know. So I completely agree with what you were saying. Just thought I'd slide that in there. Sorry.
Thank you, Rachel. I think that's really a key point. And I think what we could perhaps do if people want to is just think about that idea of when the bit when people maybe are suffering a bit and maybe it's a bit in silence and maybe it's kind of they need something, but maybe it's not kind of like really high level acute stuff. And that kind of leads us in a little bit to Tula's question, which is about ways to wellbeing. And ways to wellbeing is free courses. I think they're free or very low cost courses. I think it's a mix at Southend Adult Community College, which was set up a few years ago specifically for people with sort of mild to moderate mental health issues that are affecting the quality of their life. And Tula's question was, what sort of learning might be useful for people? What age is it, Tula? What's the ages you can take people from?
It's free for 19 plus, but we have had younger, but they have to pay because they're out of the funding bracket.
So that's already we've got that issue with that kind of, it's the other way around though, anyway.
But then there is ways and means and there is access funds and all sorts of stuff. So it's not clear cut, but just to put it there that it's an adult service type of thing, 19 plus.
So tell us what you offer already.
Well, it's been quite wide range. One that fills up all the time, we do a lot of pottery, arts. We've had French, IT, photography, anything that would be something that would interest people. But then I'm sort of racking my brains, what would be there to offer? I do ask people, but the co-production, what I understand about it a little bit now, would be great to actually formulate that program so that it's co-produced by those who, instead of putting it out there and saying, well, if you fancy pottery, come here, that it would actually reflect what is helpful and what is needed. Because at the moment, it's all of them are like 5 weeks between half terms and stuff, where now it could be that something's three sessions, something's 20. So it is like instead of putting out there like an Argos catalogue saying pick something, would be something that is actually needed, and someone will just bring it up and maybe, I don't know, but that's my idea why I'm sitting here.
I think that's a really great offer, actually, that we could perhaps take forward for anyone who wants to be interested in helping Tula out, perhaps with what is it that people would be interested in doing. So there are lots of benefits to learning for mental health. Ways to Wellbeing was set up because it was part of a national research project across the country, which showed that the access to community learning had as good outcomes for mild to moderate mental health as IAPT say. So not everybody wants to go and talk about their problems necessarily with therapists, but maybe they'd like to do a bit of learning. So maybe there's a way that we can kind of connect people who'd like to have those conversations, unless people have suggestions here, because everyone's saying pottery, Tula.
Yes, we all love pottery.
But I think there's something about pottery, because it's kind of, you know, there's research that shows.
If we turned the whole college into a pottery, two stories, we could still fill it all up. But when we did a questionnaire, we asked learners to write down why they are in the college, what is it? And there was one that was, and I think it could have been from Ways to Wellbeing. If it wasn't there, I wouldn't be there, and that really made me quite choked. That it was important to come and meet and reason to leave house and do something meaningful, and that really sort of stopped me.
Just on the back of that, Tula, I mean, what about sort of U3A groups and the way they sort of engage with older people and get involved in? And when I worked at the museum, we had quite a few groups coming in. It brought a bit of community, but also history and heritage is quite good for people with dementia. So that kind of route might be a way to sort of go down as well as another offering. And I think what you were saying earlier, just to touch upon in terms of, you know, one day you're chipper, one day, you know, you're not. And I think it's having those resources there for the day that you're not. So even when you know, if you just want to go and learn, if you could offer it perhaps more on a as and when basis, you know, perhaps that's what I think my point was more about culture being more open to people with mental health. Because if you've got a safe space you can go to, I don't know, be that a gallery, a library that's got an offering for you, because there's a lot of sort of linking between culture and mental health and how it can be really beneficial. But perhaps we don't do enough to encourage it in the town. I think people will talk a lot more about green spaces and how green spaces are brilliant for mental health, and they are. They're right. I mean, at the moment, I'm so glad I got Priory Park around the corner, because I would really be struggling otherwise. But we've got a lot more we can offer. I think there's a few ways to link in culture, maybe.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, and I'm glad you brought it up, Rob, because that was one of your questions. How can culture be linked in? And maybe that is something that we could take forward with it doesn't have to be a learning angle, but I think it works quite well if it is. I mean, those of you who know me, I used to work at the college, so, you know, and I'm a learning addict. I like learning all the time, so I kind of promote that. So but I didn't want to promote things particularly today. I just wanted to kind of explore things with people as they wanted to. So there were some other questions which I'll just read out as well. Gemma Gates is here from Pacey, and she was interested in what there is available for, what support there is for children in early years. Gemma, are you still here?
Sorry, yes, I'm still here. My internet's playing up, so you can't see me. You only get my name today. Yes, I predominantly have always worked within early years, and it's as the company the organisation I work with at the moment called Pacey. We are looking at ways to supporting mental health and wellbeing And through our research, we've kind of found that there isn't a lot of support for children in the early years. It's kind of not identified, I suppose, early on. For whatever reason. It's normally when they get into primary school, from probably about 7 up, that support starts to come in. So I was just wondering if there's any organisations that anyone specifically know of or have access to themselves that are supporting predominantly those probably between 2 and 5 years.
Thanks, Gemma. I'll have to throw that out. Is anybody aware of services? Is it a gap?
You've got Early Help and Little Heroes, but I can't think of many others that I could have accessed for the younger age groups.
We support parents. We have a service that does support parents in the perinatal period, but I'm not sure if that's exactly the same thing. I might have got that wrong.
Yeah, I do. There is a lot of support for families and obviously for the parents of the children, but I think sometimes the children are missed themselves. Sometimes they've seen a lot, have gone through a lot in their very young little lives, and this normally transpires when they get later on in school, and I think this is why there is more support at that age. As they get older, they are able to voice it more. But I think, you know, if we are able to put something in place where we know that there has been some kind of trauma or something's gone on in their life, that they probably would need to work out within those early years, rather than having for it to come out when they get older. And normally that unfolds as having behaviour issues, and again it's just put down to behaviour, and it's not being targeted, it's not being actually sorted out. So it's kind of trying to find where those children can get support. And there are programs in schools, so you've got like nursery schools and receptions, etc. But I think that, you know, teachers are very, very busy. I completely respect that. And when they have a program which is there to support personal, social, and emotional well-being, sometimes if there's not time in the day, it's not done because it's not seen as vital or important as getting your English and your maths done, etc. So I think, you know, I think it's something that needs to be looked at. And that's why I was just kind of worrying, well, I am worried about the children, but it's kind of thinking about what else is out there, or what could be adapted, what's already out there that could be adapted to meet those children.
I think that's a really interesting question, Jo, and this is the sort of thing that I feel starts to kind of lend itself to perhaps a further co-productive conversation in some ways. I don't know what other people think, but I suppose people find it hard to think that younger children might have issues with mental health, but I think, you know, experience says that they do. Certainly children may have adverse experiences in childhood, which we know about, which lead to sort of trauma in later life potentially. And I went to a really good training that was offered through CENDIAS around how adults could work with children that might have had some trauma in their lives. So I think this maybe this is a gap, because you're right, schools can't do it all. I don't know what other people think.
No, they can't. The other one I've just remembered about, and I always get the initials round the wrong way, is UMS. I know they've recently to SAB, haven't they? They used to be by SABs, but now they're not. But I'm not sure what age you can self-refer to them for either.
Okay. I think it's 5. One thing that I'm an advocate in the autistic community, and I'm autistic myself. And one thing that we're finding time and time again is that there are a lot of children who are autistic or who are pathological demand avoidance profile of autism, who get very, very traumatized at school simply because of the environment and whatnot. And these kids so often fall through the net. So that's an area that desperately needs looking at some point, if possible. I mean, my son is now a school refuser and he's 5. He lasted 1 term at school, and the trauma he had from being at school, he'll probably never go to school again. He will now be homeschooled. But that side of it is kind of, because it's not a labelled mental health, it's not depression, it's not schizophrenia, it's not a medically treatable mental health issue. It seems to be, oh well, if we can't fix it quickly, then we're not even going to acknowledge it. We're just going to sweep it over there because we can't fix it, so we'll just leave it alone. Whereas these kids need the support, they need the understanding, and a lot of training needs to be done within schools to understand children's mental health issues, and also the way that it comes across, because some children with terrible anxiety will put on a mask and pretend to be absolutely fine all day at school, and then come home and explode because they've been holding it in all day. So the teachers go, oh well, they're absolutely fine, and they're not. They are experiencing trauma, and this is something that, for the mental health side of things, that recognition needs to be improved. So I've got my soapbox in it.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you for that. I think it's, but soapbox is fine, and I don't think it was soapbox, but even if it was, but it's that passion really that people have for what's going on in their lives that really brings us to the kind of co-production conversation in the first place. Otherwise we wouldn't really be here. So I think we do need that, and it's about harnessing that. I was just reflecting when you were talking that I think we talk about trauma-informed practice once the trauma's happened, or, you know, and perhaps we're not thinking so much about it for everybody. It's a bit like having a world that's designed for, you know, the people that are on the neurodiverse spectrum of things, or, you know, people with physical, you know, if it's accessible for everybody, everybody benefits. If everybody does trauma practice, everybody benefits. So I think sometimes it helps to think about where we put those things. So I'm making some notes about that, and I'm also keeping an eye on the time, which isn't my strong point. Does anyone else want to speak about, Gemma, just to clarify, when you were talking about the younger children, did you have an age range particularly in mind? Just so
yeah, well, early years is kind of predominantly from 0 to 5, so, but obviously it's going to be from talkers, so from 2 to 5 really, I suppose, would be the target.
And would you say that in your practice that you do see children of that young who would be having some issues around mental health and well-being?
Well, I've been in early years for nearly probably about 19 years, and yes, I would say I've met quite a few children that have needed mental health support, which hasn't been identified because there hasn't been support there for them, and normally just put down to behaviour issues and not looking at the younger picture. But then studies have shown that even trauma that's happened before being born can also affect, obviously, the brain development, etc. So there's lots of things that go on beforehand. So I think really it's taking it back and looking and working with health and team and health and families and all these different organisations, and actually looking at those early years to find out if there's anything that's gone on in those early years that, you know, needs addressing at a young age.
Thank you for sharing that, because it's just so interesting and fascinating and insightful. And I've long had a hypothesis that the trauma of birth, so kinds of births with forceps and von twos and that sort of thing, I think there's probably something there that is probably being researched. But, you know, I think you're right about pre-birth, birth, young children. So I'm writing that down, because what I want to just say is that these conversations are not just us shooting the breeze. Hopefully they're the start of ongoing conversations, and that's why I've not been I don't want to be directing in the session, and that's the reasons why we've not really done the introductions outside the chat, because we didn't have a lot of time, and because we just wanted to create that sort of equal space where we could just speak to what people brought up. There was another question from Jane that was around, I think it was around accommodation. Is Jane still here?
Yes, I'm still here. Yeah, I was just interested really for some ideas. Essex County Council did a fair bit of engagement work with the cases that were supported through our commissioning of the mental health accommodation pathway, with a view to understanding how we might develop services or commission the development of services to better meet their needs. We're just about to start retender planning for the next round of contracts for the accommodation providers. And I'm looking for really good ways, I suppose, to engage groups of people who have used the accommodation or are currently living in the accommodation. And I wondered if anyone had any bright ideas about methods that I could use that actually were relatively straightforward and comfortable, perhaps. You know, always looking for fresh ideas and ways to engage, really. I just wondered if anybody had any suggestions in respect to that. We're starting to use increasingly services where we specify that we'd like to try lived experience support workers, for example, and there definitely seems to be some benefits in this respect. So I'm sort of thinking along those lines, and I wondered if anyone had any suggestions or had undertaken any exercises like this to get feedback from people using the services that really worked well.
I think Joe's going to say something. No, I'm misreading the room. Sorry, Joe, apologies. So just to be clear, so the ask is around how to engage with people who might use accommodation for people with mental health issues?
Yes, these are basically people on accommodation pathways to recovery. So services that provide supported accommodation on discharge from hospital, and then step down services beyond that into independent housing. It's not always been the easiest provision to commission well, and I'm used to working on the provider side to run well. And I'm looking really for as many different ways that work as possible to engage all the stakeholders, but I feel that the people who know the accommodation and have been referred through it are a really critical part of this conversation. And just one of the things that came back on our feedback was that they liked people with lived experience, they liked to talk to people who had lived experience of mental health problems, and that this was very helpful. So I wondered if anyone had undertaken a similar approach to engaging and co-producing with adults. I'm conscious that we've mostly been talking about children and early years, which is great, but...
Well, I suppose not specifically accommodation. I'm interested in talking to the people that are already there. Because when Sarah and I worked at Recovery College together, and Joe Tyler was our commissioner, so we've all tipped up today. But I feel that it's people are there using the services, and they'll probably be able to say what works, what doesn't work. And certainly in our Recovery College model, certainly I identify with having lived experience of mental health, and so did some of my colleagues, as did students who came on and then kind of did training and became course facilitators and other things within the college. So, and I do remember from that time that the people in the room, new students particularly, would say, "Oh, I was so nervous," but when I know people have had, have had lived experience, I'm immediately more at ease.
Yeah, this is something that I think is becoming clearer and clearer, which I think is really positive. But I also wanted to look at the attitudes of people who need to access the services, because I thought it was quite an interesting feedback that they gave, was that they didn't want to talk about these issues to people in suits, which I thought was interesting, because my immediate response to that would be, just because someone's wearing a suit, it doesn't mean they don't have lived experience of mental health. and that actually the important thing is the connection, relationship, and understanding between, you know, yourself and support worker or whoever it is. So I wanted to create, as far as possible, safe spaces where we could have some really interesting and chats around this, so that we can get a sense of, you know, what would be a really positive way forward, that might really encourage confidence and trust in the services.
Genesis is going to say something.
Hi everybody. Sorry, I was a bit late for the party, unfortunately. I don't know, I missed about half hour of this. I'm not sure if this has been addressed already or not. Speaking as an advocate for mental health, from experiencing it myself and family that have been through it, I recently raised some money for, well, I attempted to raise £7,000 for 7 charities by fasting on just water for 7 days to raise awareness about suicide and mental health issues. And what I found was throughout this whole process was the subject of mental health issues is quite very much taboo generally in society, but very much specifically for BAME communities. And what I found was there's actually nothing around to support BAME communities with that. Unless I'm wrong, this is probably the best platform to actually inquire about that. Does anybody know of anything that is there to support that? Because there's so many factors that play in to why it's so stigmatized in BAME communities, I find, like cultural aspects, religious aspects as well. And I noticed it quite a lot through, I work for Everyone Health. I noticed it just throughout this whole COVID business, and how certain families were also putting themselves at risk because of lack of an open dialogue about these subjects, and actually exasperating the mental health issues that might be happening because of, you know, finances, people putting themselves at risk because they don't want to implicate themselves financially. And I could go on and on, but I just thought I would open that subject up here.
Yeah, it's about creating places where that dialogue can happen in a comfortable, meaningful way, isn't it? That actually can help push something forward. It's quite a challenge, I think, because you're right, the taboos are still there. I think it's great we've got this piece of work at ECC that has already been carried out by someone with lived experience, and you know, I think that was a very good starting point. So we're quite keen to build on those, because I think it's important to create the opportunity for that dialogue, but then to also progress forward with, you know, whoever wants to engage in that and actually progress and build trust that actually there is an opportunity to influence, and that actually the more we work together, then the more able we are to break down some of these taboos and try and address them in a meaningful way. I suspect the answer is it just totally depends on who you're talking to and where that person is, sort of physically, but also in hopefully their recovery or their management of their condition. So I think it's quite an interesting one, but what I don't want to happen is for those individuals who happen to be confident and have something very specific to say, to come forward. I want to try and get a broader view, which is always challenging in any, you know, when you approach any group of people, you know, whether it's professional or in the community, really. So I just wondered, I'm after nicking other people's successful techniques, really.
Yeah, I guess that is it. What techniques? Because I feel like it's about trying to normalize, especially for men as well. I found, you know, statistics for young men, suicide, etc. The figures are absolutely staggering. So if you were to add BAME into that as well as male, you can imagine how, you know, the whole, you know, be a big boy and be tough, and, you know, we can't talk about things, all of that. So you just keep suppressing it more and more and more. And I'd like to normalize just, you know, those who know me personally said, oh, you're so sensitive, aren't you? Well, you know what? At least I get it out, don't I? I feel so much better for getting it out.
Thank God, that's all I can say.
This is it. And I want to normalize that. I want it to be normal to just talk. You know, there's, you know, when you get mental health awareness weeks, etc., everybody all of a sudden comes out with their stories. But why do we have to wait for one specific week? Why can't we just normalize it and just talk about it normally? Don't wait. There's so much, what really upsets me is this whole, go and check after your friend. How about we just go and just talk to our friends or just talk to anybody. Like I said, I found over 15 to 20 charities available, and I guess from personal experience, there's no one size, but it's about trying to encourage each other to just try as many different modalities and ways of trying to address this, because there's no one size fits all. We're all so individual.
I think the challenge, I guess.
I think I can see Tula, Scott. Have you got your hand up, Tula? Thank you for that. There is a gap for mental health services, Genesis, to answer the question. Tula.
Just when you say about the announcing the week when you can talk, I upset some people when I'm having a bad day and I'm not boxed into a box. I'm seen as whatever, and I say I'm actually having a really bad day and I don't think whatever it is feeling, and I say it out, and people get uncomfortable because I don't sort of fulfill the role that they see me in. But I say it out because once I've said it, it already is helping me. And if others get uncomfortable, then I can't really help it, really.
And that's what we have to change. That's what we have to change, the way people reciprocate that. Of course, we must be cautious. You know, not everybody can handle certain information, but in the same breath, you shouldn't have to shrink yourself at the, you know, the cost of your mental health just because people feel uncomfortable. Now it's like a double-edged sword, isn't it? Everybody's now feeling uncomfortable. You feel uncomfortable because you had to keep quiet.
It kicks up the other. You guys are doing such a good job here. This is a bit of an experiment because this is the first conversation that's been smaller. We haven't really talked about COVID, which was Georgina's question. We've got 5 minutes. There's so much good stuff in the chat. Like, we will send out the chat notes. Roger's grabbing those for me. I was a bit confused because he's called Heather today.
Confused by that.
But we will send out the chat because there are offers in there and people can link up and things. So I think just to pick up on Jane's point about kind of, it's about people feeling comfortable, I guess, and then they'll tell you, then they'll give that feedback. But the challenge is how you do that. So how do we want to wrap that up? Do we want to talk about challenges in the time of COVID for 5 minutes, because there has been a big impact on mental health because of lockdown and transitioning back and in and out and however it goes. People have lost people. It's been a difficult time and continues to be. Does anybody want to speak to that?
See, I know I touched on this. I think that's probably, we're yet to actually see how large a scale the actual implications of this lockdown have been on mental health. I do a coffee and catch up on Facebook every Wednesday, and the reoccurring theme seems to be around anxiety and around just the fear of how we move forward. As much as the term new normal keeps being thrown around, you know, a lot of people have lost jobs. There's so much job uncertainty. Like you said, people have lost people, and I think that's probably going to be one of our biggest issues. And mental health first aid is definitely going to be something that I think anybody who's within the health and wellbeing industry should probably get involved in, and we try and share that so people can identify, you know, those early signs of mental health issues that may have already actually existed, but now probably being exacerbated by, you know, the times that we live in, because we're not out of the woods just because we've had a couple of hot weekends and, you know, the pubs open this weekend. I think, if anything, that probably, for those who are already sinking, that probably gave them license to just, you know, go and drink themselves silly and make the situation worse. As we know, the effects of alcohol on mental health issues, you know, there's a bad relationship there potentially. So, yeah, I'm worried, if I'm completely honest.
Can I just pick up a chat that Emily Harris has made? And she said one of the most horrible tricks childhood anxiety might encourage is quietness. And then that can become encouraged and rewarded. I'm thinking perhaps in educational settings or even in the home, because adults will think these children are well behaved, but actually they might be really suffering underneath that. And I think that does link into COVID, because, you know, as Genesis is making the point, people might just go and blow off some steam and have fun. That's what it looks like on the face of it. But for some people, that might actually just be a coping mechanism for what's going on for them. Joanne?
Yeah, ignore them. They've got to a point where they're fighting now. They've been well behaved all afternoon, but just going to ignore them now. I think the other thing we need to think about and touch on a little bit is grief. And I don't just necessarily mean the grief that comes from people passing away. From a parent's point of view, there's so much grief and guilt coming through because our children have missed almost an entire half a year at school because of this. And I know that we all feel so much guilt. We feel, oh, but this person's been able to get their children to do their schoolwork, but I haven't. And it all comes under the bracket of grief, because when you start processing it and looking back on it, you're going to start realising that although the journey hasn't been how you expected it to be, it's words are gone just like yesterday, but it's all to do with how you've got to look at it and process it and come to terms with what you've lost and your children have lost, and then work forward from it.
That's a really great reflection, Joanne. Yeah, it does feel like we need to be a bit more nimble, perhaps, in the issues that we come around as we're dealing with COVID. So, you know, I know there was great groups for anxiety and things like that, but loss of milestones for parents is going to be a real particular one, and processing it together is, you know, my daughter's missed her prom and her GCSEs, and you know, so yeah, my words have gone as well, which shows that there's some emotional content there, right? I'll leave it at that. Is there anyone else who wants to say anything? Because it's just been such a rich conversation. There's been so much in the chat. What I'm going to propose, am I missing anyone who wants to speak? No.
I think so.
Thank you. What I'm going to propose is that I've got the notes and I've got the chat, is if I summarise what the themes were and the things that we could potentially look to take forward in some way, and see what the appetite is for another catch up in perhaps in this way, because co-production week is a week, but really it's the start of hopefully more co-productive conversations. So if I commit to contacting you all by the end of the week with the notes, with the themes, and then you just come back to me and say, yeah, I'm interested in this, no, I'm not interested in that, and then we can kind of reconvene perhaps around those particular interests and themes that I've noted. Do people feel that would be useful?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, there's a few thumbs up, and if it's not useful, that's fine. And I just want to thank you all for coming today and contributing to the discussion. This is a kind of interesting and new way of doing things in some ways for me. So we will be sending out an evaluation thing, not after this session, but after the whole week has commenced. So if this really doesn't work for you, then please just tell us and perhaps say how we could do it better or different, and we'll take that on board. But other than that, I think it just remains for me to say thank you, and see you all again soon. I'll just hang on here for a moment in case anyone wants to just say anything to me, but other than that, thank you for your time and have a great evening.
And you too. Thanks ever so much, Jessica, for hosting this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
I will always, after Zoom, wave in face-to-face meetings when I leave. We'll take that as a bit.
I know what you mean, Tula. I've done so many now that it just seems like you've got to wave or do something to acknowledge the questions that you've had, isn't it?
Lovely, everybody.
Bye.
And you. Bye-bye. Bye. Right, Roger, I'm going to kind of get off the call if no one's staying too long, so you don't have to chop it.
Esmeralda.
I've got the chat and I'll send the notes to you as well.
Thanks very much, Heather.
Yeah. That is
Thank
you, Roger. I'm changing the WhatsApp groups and everything.
That's my new nickname.
I'll speak to you tomorrow, Jessica.
Yeah, see you later, Joe.